This is an excerpt from a short story I wrote called Greenhouse. It was not a year that cicadas appeared, but it should have been. They should have raised a riot of noise, a sustained warning, when my father first topped the ridge at Locust Grove. He drove a horse-drawn wagon, the contents of which made the wagon bed sag slightly, as if a great meal had been consumed by an odious four-wheeled creature. Oilcloth covered the cargo, blackened from many miles of travel. I recognized him right away, even from a distance, and I said, "Ma, it's Daddy." She told me to hush up, that it wasn't nice to lie. I repeated what I said with conviction, my truth a bulwark against retribution. It was natural for Mother to doubt me, for I had in fact falsely announced Father's return many times. And also, when he left 4 years previous, he'd been on foot, marching. To think he'd profited in some way from this war, coming home at this late date with a wagonload of swag, to say nothing of survive when we hadn't received any kind of communication in 31 months, required far too much faith on Mother's part. As I said, there were no cicadas, only a solitary cricket squeaking harmony to the wagon's dry wheel, and Mother saying, "Hush up, daughter." When Mom taught me to read, there was a period of time when I could not accustom myself to the idea that the word daughter was pronounced daughter. I kept thinking against all logic that it was pronounced dafter, the word looking so similar to laughter and all. Mother found it very amusing for a while and sometimes even said, "Hush up, Dafter," or "Fetch some water, Dafter." I almost thought she was going to change my name to Dafter, but she didn't. My name remained and still is Eden. This is a remembrance. I'm recollecting it now because Woodrow Wilson just signed the armistice, and over the last couple of years so many people have perished from war and flu that it has quite suddenly, with punishing clarity, put me in mind of another equally bleak, distant time. My father was Jeffrey Wiedenbach. My mother, his wife, Iris, is really the opponent in this story, although you could say the war between the states was the ultimate opponent. But I hate it when people do that. Try to condense some nebulous crowd into a tightly drawn character. Never works. Twain or Dickens would never have done that. Same thing with trying to say Daddy was his own opponent. Humbug, as Dickens would say. Every person is his or her own opponent, of course. That's the essence of all life's struggles. But it's a contrivance and lazy, and I'm not going to allow it here. No. Mother personified the ultimate source of opposition to Jeffrey Wiedenbach getting what he wanted, which was to come home and control his past in a meaningful way, so that he might somehow forget that he had ever marched off in a blue uniform to imprint upon his memory the horrors of close-range death. I suppose I was the lever that moved Father into some kind of action, and if that's so, then the fulcrum of that lever was unquestionably his garden. It was fashionable in those days to give a garden a proper name. This pretension was a holdover from Anglophile roots, where the entirety of an estate, once given a proper name, Heathcliff, Wellington, Bluff, I'm just imagining examples, could be considered a flesh-and-blood being and thereby sanctified and inviolable. There was some sense to this, I thought, and while I'd been quite young when Jeffrey Wiedenbach left us and had no initial familiarity with this convention, once it was revealed to me by Mother, I obsessed upon it. Why hadn't my father named our garden? And indeed, in his absence, the thing became a nameless orphan with fly-away knit-infested hair. The more than 4 acres that the garden occupied in the back of our property at the base of Locust Grove was far too unwieldy for any one person, let alone a woman and child, to maintain. Bushy-tailed, barking squirrels had diminished into sullen, bare-tailed rats that leapt from branch to fence with alarming alacrity. Crows taunted you if you tried to shoo them from stalks of Indian corn, which they pecked with impunity. Neighborhood goats were particularly fond of the grapes, which they'd shrewdly wait to consume until fermentation had set in before gorging themselves silly and staggering around like 4-legged devil drunkards. Pigs, of course, ran wild. It was a desperate disgrace, a nameless source of shame. Carpenter ants had also set up shop somewhere in the walls of our house. I often watched a segment of their route, the way they'd carry the most cumbersome items, many times heavier than they were, from garden to nest. Sometimes seeds, other times impractical puzzling items like twigs or leaves. I once saw a carpenter ant haul a sizable sliver of watermelon rind. What were they building in this life? You can ask the same of anyone, I suppose. Father's wagon passed through what we called the big gate and trundled to a halt. Mother did a sharp intake of breath, raised her right fist to her mouth as if kissing a lucky thumbnail. The other hand fondled the crucifix around her neck. We were one of the few Catholic families in the neighborhood, but we didn't flaunt it. The crucifix was the only affectation of faith Mother allowed. We hadn't been to Mass in ages. I had a feeling we were all going to hell, but I was beyond caring until this moment. It seemed certain and irrevocable now that I could see the dread evident in Father's hollow ultramarine eyes. "Iris," he said. Mother said nothing, just began to weep and pray silently. He turned to me. "Eden." "Hello, Daddy." I was only 5 when this war started. I'd missed him terribly. If I'd been 2 or 3 when he left, then he would have meant nothing to me now. But when you're 5, that's when the clay begins to soften. That's when things begin to leave a deep mark. I wanted to jump up into his arms, like I used to, but it was the wagon that stopped me. Underneath the darkened, dirty oilcloth, I was convinced that there must be dead bodies. I don't know why I thought this. Maybe it was the stink. Jeffrey Wiedenbach smelled as if he hadn't bathed in over a year. Looked it, too. All this warned me off. Mother set about making dinner. She said she wanted to make chicken fixings. But Father said, "Don't bother, I've got hoe cakes." So we sat down as a family for the first time in 4 years and ate something Southern that I'd only heard about. The hoe cakes weren't bad, but they weren't chicken fixings. I asked Father a few questions, but he didn't feel like talking so close to the end of what must have been a very long journey, so Mother once again advised me to hush up. But I'd had enough silent meals with Mother. I was ready for conversation, even if I was the only one to support it. I started talking about the one thing I thought might interest or distract Father from his troubles. I said I'd named the garden. After he looked at me expectantly, I said, "Garthwaite." To his vacant stare and Mother's pursed lips of annoyance, I quickly added, "That was a humorous joke, of course. In fact, it was a name I had just fabricated at that very moment." They looked like they wanted to send me straight off to bed, but I wasn't having any of it. I wasn't sassy, but I wasn't exactly well behaved. I had no siblings to steal the spotlight and could get quite inebriated on the attention that one, let alone 2 parents could give. An only child is a unified force of nature, lapping up entitlement and indulgence. I knew I wasn't wanted, so I sulked, pretending to take it personal. It was exhilarating to have an expanded audience for my capricious misbehaviors and practiced precociousness. I stayed up late listening to them from my room, mostly Mother talking, muttered monosyllables from Father. Nothing whatsoever about the war or Father's part. You'd have thought the 31 months of non-communication had been something imposed by her, for all she wanted to hear of it. Several times he ventured to share a memory, but Mother cut him off. Cut him off rudely, if you ask me. She fetched water from the well, boiled it on the stove, and drew him a hot bath, the whole time talking about her day, her week, her year, as if Father had just come home from selling a bushel of corn or apples, and we all know what he'd been up to, and who cares anyway? They might have had a row after I went off to bed, I don't know. It sure sounded like one. I fell asleep. This story also has a companion song by the same name. Thank you.